Delia Brightwood stopped a passing waiter and ordered another glass of white wine. Her husband was already 40 minutes late. It had become routine lately: important meetings, urgent business, unscheduled meetings. She absent-mindedly ran her finger along the rim of the glass, watching the customers of the Golden Vine restaurant. The restaurant's interior was reminiscent of old New York movies: dim lights, dark wood, leather sofas, the color of burgundy wine. Thursdays were usually crowded. Business meetings flowed smoothly into dinners. Her phone vibrated a message from Lance. "Sorry, honey, I'll be there in 15 minutes. Delia sighed and put the phone away. She had specifically chosen this restaurant for a serious conversation. This was where they had celebrated their first wedding anniversary. Perhaps the familiar surroundings would help them find common ground. The clinking of glasses and muffled laughter from the bar made her look up. First, she saw the dark red dress, tight, expensive, provocative for this place. Then the familiar profile of her husband. Lance was whispering something in Raven Crosby's ear, and she was throwing her head back laughing. Delia froze. Time stretched like rubber. She saw Raven's hand slip over her husband's shoulder, and he smiled, that special smile he used to save for her. Her throat went dry. Her feet carried her toward the bar on their own. She didn't remember how she'd made it the few meters. Raven spotted her first, a flicker of surprise in her dark eyes that turned to gloating. "Delia? What a surprise!" Raven stretched out, defiantly keeping her hand on Lance's shoulder. Lance jerked as if from a blow. His face paled, but he didn't say a word, just stared somewhere past his wife like she was nothing. "I was waiting for you at the table." Delia's voice sounded unaccustomedly husky. "You texted that you'd be there in 15 minutes. Raven laughed, loudly, theatrically. "Oh, honey, do you really still believe his texts? That's so sweet." She paused. "And naive." Delia shifted her gaze to her husband. "Lance?" He finally looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I was going to tell you." "When?" It sounded louder than she wanted it to. Several heads turned in their direction. "Oh, who cares when?" Raven interjected. "The important thing is that now you know, and you can stop playing the perfect wife." She picked up her wine glass. To honesty? Everything happened like it was in slow motion. Raven took a step forward as if about to clink her glass, but instead she splashed the wine in Delia's face. Red drops ran down her white blouse. "Wipe yourself off, you beggar," Raven tossed dismissively. "And do me a favor and stop stalking my man." They laughed, Raven loudly and defiantly, Lance nervously and quietly. Delia stood, feeling the wine dripping down her neck by her collar. Somewhere on the edge of her consciousness, the thought flashed that her blouse was hopelessly ruined. She slowly pulled her wallet out of her purse, pulled out a few bills and placed them on the bar. "For my wine," she said in a steady voice. Turning around, she headed for the exit, her back straight, heels clearly beating a rhythm on the parquet floor. Only in the cab did she allow herself to close her eyes and take a deep breath. Her hands trembled, nausea rising to her throat. "Home?" the driver asked. "No." She gave him her friend's address. She wouldn't be going home today. Maybe she never would. Her cell phone vibrated in her purse. Lance's. Delia turned it off without looking at the screen. Outside the cab window, the evening city floated by. She looked at the lights of shop windows, at the people rushing somewhere, at the glowing windows of offices. Everything seemed unreal, like a scene from a foreign movie. Only the smell of red wine soaking into her blouse reminded her that this was not a dream. Her friend's apartment greeted Delia with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and silence. Melissa didn't ask any unnecessary questions when she saw the crying face and ruined blouse. She silently poured strong coffee, pulled out an old terry robe from the closet, and left her friend alone in the guest bedroom. 3 days flew by like a blur. Delia called work and took a vacation at her own expense, the first time in 5 years. Her phone was bursting with calls and messages from Lance until she blocked his number. Sitting in Melissa's small bedroom, she tried to figure out when things had started to fall apart. Perhaps the first bells had rung as early as 6 months ago. Lance had started staying late at work. Rarely at first, then more and more. There was a new perfume, a light, almost elusive trail of other people's perfume on their shirts. She found receipts from restaurants they'd never been to together. Strange phone calls during which he went into another room. Delia carefully turned a blind eye, convincing herself there was a logical explanation for everything. "Are you awake?" Melissa peeked into the room holding 2 cups of herbal tea. Thinking, Delia sat up on the bed, making room for her friend. "You know what the most frustrating thing is? I've met this Raven before, haven't I? At the charity event, remember? She was also asking me for advice on accounting for her salons." Melissa hummed. "Big money laundering expert, from what I hear. Her salons are growing like mushrooms after a rainstorm." Delia nodded absently, remembering that night. Raven had seemed nice then, charming even. Now every moment of their acquaintance was colored with new colors. The interest in her work, the chance encounters at business events, it all seemed part of some twisted plan. On the 4th day, Lance showed up at Melissa's door. Somehow he'd gotten the address, probably through mutual acquaintances. Delia watched from the window as he stomped up the driveway with a bouquet of her favorite white roses. Melissa offered not to open the door, but Delia shook her head. Sooner or later this conversation would have to happen. "You look awful," she said as she opened the door. It was true. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, shadows lingered under his eyes, and his stubble had turned into an unkempt beard. "I haven't slept." He held out the flowers to her. Delia didn't take them. "Can we talk?" They settled into a small cafe around the corner. Delia ordered only water, her throat still constricted at the thought of wine. Lance was nervously twirling a cup of cold coffee in his hands. "I blew it," he began after a long silence. "I didn't want you to find out like this. Raven. She shouldn't have—" "How much?" Delia interrupted him. "What? How long has this been going on?" He averted his eyes. 8 months. Delia nodded, as if she had received confirmation of a long-known fact. 8 months, 240 days of lies. She remembered their anniversary 2 months ago, the candlelight dinner, his gift, making love. Everything had been a lie. "I'm confused," Lance continued. "Raven. It's different with her. She's bright, free. And I'm a boring accountant." Delia grinned bitterly. "A gray mouse with a calculator." "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you mean. She said it herself. Who could be happy with a woman who only knows how to count other people's money?" Lance wrinkled his nose. "She shouldn't have said that. She was drunk." "Oh, sure. Everything can be blamed on alcohol." Delia stood up. "You know what the funny thing is? I'm really good at math, and I can see that her business is a house of cards. Sooner or later it's going to collapse." "What does her business have to do with it?" There was concern in Lance's voice. "Nothing to do with anything." Delia placed the bill of sale on the table. "Just an observation. Professional deformity, you know." She walked out of the cafe without looking back. The numbers were spinning in her head. Random snippets of financial reports from the Crystal Rose beauty salons she'd seen glimpsed. Something didn't add up in those numbers. Something wrong was hiding behind the perfectly executed documents. Back at Melissa's place, she pulled out her laptop. It was time to get back to work. After all, counting other people's money was really what she did best. And sometimes that skill could come in handy for more than just quarterly reports. "Are you okay?" Melissa asked, stopping by her place later that evening. "No," Delia answered honestly, "but I will be." She opened her mail and started going through her work emails. Lost among them was an old letter from Raven, a request for advice on tax returns. Delia saved it in a separate folder. Perhaps the information would still come in handy. During the night she dreamed of a restaurant, but this time she didn't stand silently while the wine dripped down her blouse. This time she smiled, looking at Raven's smug grin, and thought about how quickly a perfectly constructed facade could crumble if you knew where to push. In the morning she called the realtor. It was time to look for a new apartment. Life doesn't end with betrayal. It just takes on new forms. And sometimes those forms can be quite interesting. Returning to the IRS office after a week's absence brought Delia unexpected relief. Here, amidst the familiar file folders and the quiet hum of computers, personal problems receded into the background. Work had always been her lifeline. "Hey, Brightwood," Sarah Chandler from the pre-check department called out to her. "You specialize in the beauty industry, right? Take a look at the materials because I've got something that doesn't add up here." Delia walked over to her colleague's desk. A familiar table was glowing on the monitor, the quarterly report of one of the salons. She ran her eyes over the numbers and frowned. Strange ratio of material cost to revenue. The margins are too low for the premium segment. Whose salon? The Crystal Rose chain. Sarah flicked the document upward. Owned by one Raven Crosby. They have 12 locations around the city. Delia felt her mouth go dry. Sarah, not noticing her condition, continued. "Here's the thing. If you compare it to similar chains, they have abnormally high costs for purchasing cosmetics and equipment. At the same time, the price tag for services is in the upper segment. Let me guess. Suppliers. That's the thing. The list is pretty short. Some firms registered less than a year ago. I tried to find their actual addresses. 2 companies are registered in a business center that was demolished last year." Delia sat down on the edge of the desk, looking at the documents. Purely technically, she should have declared a conflict of interest. But then she'd have to explain its nature. "Tell you what, leave me a copy of the materials. I'll take a closer look at it on my own time." In the evening, already at home, she methodically studied the documents. An interesting picture was emerging. Crystal Rose began as a small salon in a bedroom community. Then, in less than 5 years, turned into a chain of luxury establishments. Sources of financing for the expansion looked questionable. The next day, Delia immersed herself in studying other cases, routine inspections of spas and beauty centers. There, between the lines of the financial reports, the familiar names of the vendor companies sometimes flickered, the same ghost companies that worked with Crystal Rose. "Do you have a minute?" Delia peered into the office of John Hammond, a specialist in identifying suspicious bank transactions. "Remember the massage parlor chain case last year? The ones that were cashing out through phony vendors?" "You bet I do. 3 months of digging." John pulled a weighty folder out of the closet. "You think you found something similar?" "Maybe. Let me refresh your memory." Slowly, day by day, she gathered information. No direct contacts, no personal interest, just facts, figures, and documents. From the scattered data, a portrait of Raven Crosby was emerging, far from the glossy image of a successful businesswoman, daughter of an auto mechanic from Nebraska, unfinished economic education. First salon opened with money from the sale of her father's business. Then, a meteoric rise, inexplicable from the point of view of conventional business logic. "Listen, Brightwood," Department Head Mark Peterson stopped by her desk at the end of the week. "You've checked out companies in the beauty industry before, right? There's an interesting case, an anonymous tip on a salon chain. I'll assign you to supervise?" "Sure." She carefully kept her expression neutral. "What chain?" "Crystal Rose. They have 12 locations around the city," she finished. "Yes, I've seen their paperwork before. Sarah consulted with me last week." "Great. So you're on top of things. I expect a preliminary report in a week." That evening, sitting in her new apartment, Delia reflected on the irony of the situation. She hadn't made a single wrong move, hadn't violated a single procedure. The investigation had begun without her involvement. It was now officially assigned to her as an experienced professional. The phone buzzed with a message from Lance. "We need to talk. It's work-related." She deleted the message without opening it. I wondered if he'd had time to realize that his mistress was walking on very thin ice, and that all the documents he'd helped prepare would soon be under the microscope of a tax audit. Delia opened her laptop and began writing the audit plan. Dry, professional, no personal emotions. Just another case of possible tax evasion. Just numbers, just facts. After all, the best revenge is a well-executed audit. Delia awoke in the middle of the night from a strange dream. She dreamed of their first meeting with Lance a summer evening in the park, street musicians, a glass of coffee spilled on his immaculate suit. She was working at a small accounting firm at the time, and he was just starting his career as a financial consultant. Both ambitious, both in love with numbers and clear charts. Turning on the nightlight, she sat up in bed. The new apartment seemed unaccustomedly small after their shared home. There was no designer furniture or panoramic windows, just the bare essentials. Just like at the beginning of their marriage, when they'd saved up for the down payment on the apartment. Everything had seemed simple and straightforward then. She admired his ability to find unconventional financial solutions for clients. He appreciated her attention to detail and professional sensitivity. They often discussed work issues, and Lance always asked her opinion before proposing a new tax optimization scheme to a client. Delia walked to the small kitchen and put the kettle on. When exactly had their conversations gotten shorter? When had Lance stopped sharing details of his projects? Probably about a year ago, when he'd taken on some big new clients. "They have a specific business," he explained evasively. "Lots of cash transactions, complicated structure." She hadn't insisted. After all, everyone had their own work ethic. Something had changed in his behavior since these new clients had arrived. Late returns, business trips, business dinners had become more frequent. There were new suits, expensive watches, a sports car. She'd written it off as a successful career, but now, scrolling through the events of the last year, Delia was beginning to notice oddities. Delia pulled an old box of photos out of the closet. Their wedding, she in a simple white dress, he in a dark suit. A honeymoon in Europe. A housewarming party in their first apartment. Each photo is a success story of a young couple building a future together. Last year's photos looked different. Lance in suits from famous designers, a new car, their luxurious home. She'd never asked where the money for all this came from. She thought his career had just taken off. But now, looking at the dates on the photos, she saw a clear pattern. The dramatic increase in their wealth had begun around the same time that the Crystal Rose salon chain had appeared in his client base. Delia began pacing around the apartment, reconstructing the details in her mind. Lance had never worked with the beauty industry before. His specialty was manufacturing companies, wholesale. Why was he suddenly taking on beauty salons? And why was he so nervous when she mentioned the financial state of Raven's business? One evening about 6 months ago came to mind. Lance was working from home, spreading out papers on his desk. She'd brought him coffee and happened to notice familiar company names, the same fictitious suppliers that were now popping up in the Crystal Rose files. He had then very abruptly rolled up all the paperwork, saying it was confidential information. Delia paused at the window. During her years in the tax office, she had seen many tax avoidance schemes, fictitious suppliers, inflated expenses, double-entry bookkeeping. All were classic techniques, and judging by the documents of the Crystal Rose, the scheme was built professionally. Too professional for the former owner of a small Nebraska beauty parlor. She remembered their last conversation in the cafe. His concern when she'd mentioned Raven's business, the nervousness with which he'd tried to change the subject. Everything was falling into place now. Lance wasn't just dating Raven. He was helping her build all these schemes, creating dummy companies, preparing false accounting. In the morning, Delia pulled out old family albums and began methodically cutting Lance out of the photos. It was childish, perhaps even silly, but each cut with the scissors was strangely satisfying. Along with the images of her husband, she was cutting the last illusions of their marriage out of her life. Getting ready for work, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Strict suit, neat hair, minimal makeup, the image of a typical tax auditor. Raven was right about one thing. She really only knew how to count other people's money. But sometimes that skill could become a very dangerous weapon. Delia spent Thursday evening at Melissa's. After work, she didn't want to go back to the empty apartment where everything reminded her that it was a temporary shelter. Her friend didn't ask any unnecessary questions, just opened a bottle of wine and ordered Chinese food. Lance called today. Delia twirled her glass in her hands. Says he's realized everything, that it was a mistake, that he only loves me. Melissa remained silent, giving her friend a chance to speak. You know what the worst part is? I still love him, don't I? 8 years can't just be crossed off. Delia set her glass on the table. Sometimes I wake up at night and my first thought is to call him, tell him I forgive him, that we can start over. Rain drizzled outside the window, blurring the lights of the evening city. Delia walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. In the reflection, she saw her face, drained with circles under her eyes. Remember how we met? He spilled coffee on me and then apologized for an hour and told me about some complicated financial scheme. I thought at the time, here's a man who speaks the same language as me. She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. And then there were these little moments. He always remembered what my favorite tea was, left notes with silly accounting jokes, was supportive when I decided to move to the IRS. But? Melissa asked quietly. But now I know he's helping Raven skirt the law. And it's not just their affair. He's deliberately building tax avoidance schemes. All those fictitious vendors, false accounting. It's not just tax optimization anymore. It's a crime. Delia returned to the table and picked up her glass. Sometimes I think, should I turn a blind eye? Pretend I can't see the obvious? Go back home, forgive him. And then I remember that night at the restaurant. How they laughed. How he looked at me in silence when she threw wine at me. And I realized that's not the Lance I loved anymore. Melissa stood up and put her arm around her friend's shoulders. You know the difference between love and affection? Love makes us become better people, and affection sometimes makes us turn a blind eye to how we're getting worse. Delia shuddered. He really did love me once, didn't he? And I loved him. But now you have to decide. Are you willing to love a man who betrayed not only you, but his principles as well? They sat up late into the night. Melissa told some stories from office life, tried to distract her friend, but Delia's thoughts returned to her husband again and again, to their first meetings, to their plans together, to how they dreamed of a big house and children. At home, already lying in bed, she pulled out her phone and opened their old photos. Here was Lance teaching her to ski. Here they are celebrating her promotion. Here's their first Christmas together. The phone vibrated. A new message from Lance. I miss you. Let's talk. I'll explain everything. Delia stared at the screen for a long moment. Her finger hovered over the reply button. How easy it would be to write, yes, let's talk. Go home. Pretend it never happened. Forget about Raven. Forget about the tax scam. Forget about that humiliating night at the restaurant. But she already knew she couldn't. It wasn't about pride or even wanting revenge. It was just that she remembered too well the Lance who talked about honesty in business and professional ethics. The man who'd admired her integrity. The man she'd fallen in love with years ago. That man was gone. In his place was another, one who helps his mistress cheat the state, who is willing to overstep professional ethics for money, who watches in silence as his wife is humiliated. The morning began with the smell of burnt eggs. Delia had never been a good hostess. Lance usually cooked while she did the numbers. Scraping the burnt remains of breakfast off the skillet, she thought once again how much her life had changed in the last month. The new apartment was slowly taking on the details of everyday life. A mug with a chipped edge, bought at the nearest supermarket. A blanket Melissa had brought in. An old chair found at a rummage sale. All different from her and Lance's home, but slowly becoming her own. At work, she immersed herself in studying the Crystal Rose records. What had once seemed merely suspicious was now taking shape. Delia methodically wrote out details in her notebook, dates of registration of suppliers, contract amounts, discrepancies in the accounts. On her lunch break, she walked to one of Raven's salons. Without going inside, she simply observed through the window. Luxurious interior, expensive furniture, receptionist with impeccable styling. And behind that facade, a jumble of bogus vendors and suspicious transactions. That evening, while sorting through boxes of old things, Delia came across a file folder of documents from their shared home with Lance. Among the papers, she found his old business cards, the first ones with the modest title of financial consultant. Now, his business cards read senior partner. Wonder how many schemes like Raven's had helped him get that promotion. She stayed late in the office on Friday, collating data on salon equipment purchases. The numbers stubbornly didn't add up. According to the paperwork, the chain had purchased a batch of expensive beauty equipment, but the electric bills didn't show a corresponding increase in energy consumption. She had dinner past midnight, microwaving a frozen lasagna. She and Lance used to cook together often on weekends. He'd add red wine to the sauce. She joked about the double booking of spices, now that wine was associated only with a ruined blouse and Raven's evil laugh. On Saturday, Delia decided to do some cleaning. Dusting the shelves, she turned on the news. They were broadcasting a story about the growth of beauty services in the city. The camera slid over the Crystal Rose sign, showing interviews with satisfied customers. Delia froze with rag in hand as Raven appeared on the screen. Flawless makeup, confident smile, perfectly delivered speech about the importance of quality service. In the evening, she pulled out Lance's old laptop. He'd forgotten it when he'd picked up his things. Delia hadn't planned to turn it on, but now, looking at the black screen, she thought, why not? She knew the password the day of their wedding. Apparently, Lance didn't think it was necessary to change it. There were a lot of interesting things in the working papers folder. Drafts of vendor contracts, preliminary estimates, flow charts. Everything looked very professional, no obvious irregularities. Everything adhered to the letter of the law. But Delia had been working with such documents for too long not to see behind the perfect facade of the true picture. She spent Sunday systematizing her findings. Every detail fit into the big picture. The scheme was well thought out, but there were weaknesses. For example, regular receipts of large sums of cash, supposedly from clients, or invoices for renting the premises where the suppliers were located. In the evening, her mother called to ask how she was doing. Delia had given her some generalities. She couldn't explain to her parents that her husband hadn't just cheated on her, but was involved in financial fraud. They wouldn't understand. To them, Lance had always been the perfect son-in-law. Before going to bed, she stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the lights of the city. Somewhere out there, in the luxurious home she'd once considered her own, Lance might be working on new schemes for Raven's business, or they're celebrating another successful deal together. Delia stopped in front of the store window, scrutinizing her reflection. She'd lost weight in recent weeks, but her business suit still fit flawlessly. Today she had an important appointment at the bank, a routine check of several companies' account records. She ran into Raven at the bank door. She was coming out accompanied by Lance, both of them engrossed in conversation. Delia instinctively stepped aside, but it was too late. They'd spotted her. "What an unexpected meeting," Raven stretched out with feigned friendliness. "Come to check on someone's accounts?" Lance turned pale, but quickly pulled himself together. "Delia, I can explain everything." "What exactly?" She calmly adjusted the file folder. "Why are you accompanying a client to the bank after hours? Or why you're helping with questionable transactions?" "Questionable?" Raven laughed. "Honey, not everyone who's more successful than you is doing something illegal. Some people just know how to run a business." "And launder money," Delia added quietly. Raven stepped forward, her heels tapping clearly on the marble of the hallway. "What did you say? Say it again. I didn't hear you." "Raven, don't," Lance tried to stop her. "No, let her repeat it. Let that accountant tell me what she came up with in her dull head." Delia felt a cold rage begin to boil up inside. "You know the interesting thing about numbers? They never lie. There's a trail behind every transaction you make, every bogus vendor, and sooner or later it will lead where it needs to go." "Threatening me? You?" Raven splayed her hands picturesquely. "Lance, honey, your ex has completely lost her sense of reality. Maybe she needs psychiatric help." Lance remained silent, shifting his gaze from one woman to the other. Delia stared at him, trying to see in this confused man the man she once loved. "You know what's really funny?" Raven continued, pulling a lipstick out of her purse. "You're so proud of your integrity, your honesty, and yet you're willing to use your official position to settle personal scores." "I'm just doing my job." "Of course you are," Raven pursed her lips defiantly. "By the way, how are you doing on a tax collector's salary? I bet you miss our home now, don't you, Lance?" Delia felt the color flood her face. "Ours? Oh, I'm sorry, you didn't know. I moved in with Lance last week. You know, the house was definitely lacking a woman's touch, such drab minimalism everywhere. I had to change a few things." Delia looked at her husband. He lowered his eyes, avoiding her gaze. "One more thing." Raven stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you think you can prove anything, think twice. I have good lawyers and very powerful friends." "And what do you have? A folder of papers and a bruised ego?" At that moment, something inside Delia finally snapped. She squared her shoulders and smiled, calmly and coldly. "I've got something better. Professional ethics and access to the IRS databases. And trust me, I'll find every discrepancy, every suspicious transaction. It's only a matter of time." "Empty threats," Raven snorted, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Come on, Lance, we should go." She tugged on his sleeve. Lance nodded awkwardly to Delia and followed Raven to the exit. At the door, he turned around as if he wanted to say something, but remained silent. Delia waited until they were gone before allowing herself to take a deep breath. Her hands were shaking, but her head was clear. Now she knew exactly what to do. Back in her office, she opened the Crystal Rose file and began to draw up a detailed audit plan. Every invoice, every document, every transaction, everything had to be examined with the utmost care. It was no longer a matter of personal revenge. It had become a matter of professional honor. The IRS office was quiet. Delia sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of documents. The computer screen glowed with tables of figures, the result of 2 weeks of painstaking work. She methodically checked the data on equipment purchases. According to the documents, Crystal Rose purchased a batch of expensive cosmetology devices totaling several million. But when checking, it turned out that the supplier company was registered only a month before the transaction, and as an address indicated a building demolished last year. Delia opened the next folder. The payroll records were full of oddities. The names of employees were repeated in different salons, and some were paid by working at 3 locations at the same time. Yet the tax deductions were impeccably filed. She reached for a cup of long, cold coffee. Lately, she had been staying late at the office a lot. No one was waiting for her at home, and working helped her not think about the fact that Raven was now living in their former home. The phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Melissa. "Are you going out to dinner tonight or are you working again?" Delia smiled and put the phone away. Just a little more. She was almost finished analyzing the flow of funds through the corporate accounts. The scheme was clever. The money passed through a chain of shell companies, each time changing the purpose of the payment, but in some cases the amounts didn't add up, creating subtle discrepancies. There was a knock on the door. The cleaning lady looked surprised at the light in the office. "Excuse me, I'll work some more," Delia smiled guiltily. Digging deep into the documents again, she continued to build a chain of evidence. Here was a lease agreement for a space for one of the salons. The amount was suspiciously low for such an upscale neighborhood. A check showed that the owner of the building was another one-day firm. Delia opened a new file and began to compile a summary report. All the evidence was itemized: fictitious equipment and material suppliers, overcharges for repairs and maintenance, non-existent employees on payroll, suspicious cash transactions, lease agreements through shell companies. At first glance, each violation looked minor, but together they added up to a picture of massive financial fraud. Delia looked at her watch almost midnight. She saved the file and leaned back in her chair. There was enough evidence to start an official audit. One call to her superiors and the machinery would be in motion. Checks, interrogations, account seizures. Her hand reached for the phone but stopped halfway. Somewhere in the back of my mind there was still hope that Lance would come to his senses, that he'd realize what he'd gotten himself into, that he'd remember his principles. She pulled an old picture of him from university out of her bag, an ambitious young student dreaming of an honest career in finance. When had he had time to change so much? At what point had money and success become more important than professional ethics? The phone rang, snapping her out of her musings. Lance. She stared at the blinking screen, fighting the urge to answer, to tell him about the evidence she'd gathered, to warn him, to give him a chance to make things right. The phone went silent. Delia opened the mail and began drafting a memo to management. Revolutionary upheavals were sometimes necessary, even if it was just a tax audit of one chain of beauty salons. In the morning, she placed a folder of collected materials on her supervisor's desk. The documents were laid out in perfect order, like bullets in a clip. "Are you sure of your conclusions, Brightwood?" The chief flipped through the report. "Absolutely. Every fact is documented." She left the office with a sense of accomplishment. The mechanism had been set in motion, and no one, not even herself, could stop it. On her way home, Delia stopped by the supermarket. A bottle of good wine, cheese, and a fresh baguette went into the basket. Tonight she was going to celebrate, albeit alone. After all, professional integrity was also worthy of a toast. Lately, Delia had often noticed Lance's black BMW parked near her house. He never got out of the car, just sat there for hours as if gathering his wits. She pretended not to notice it as she passed by in the mornings on her way to work or as she returned from the supermarket in the evenings with her bags. The work week stretched unaccustomedly slow. The inspection of the Crystal Rose went its way. Official inquiries, answers, new inquiries. The bureaucratic machine moved unhurriedly but inexorably. Delia deliberately withdrew from direct participation in the inspection, passing all the materials to her colleagues. On Wednesday, Lance still decided to call. "We need to talk." His voice sounded unaccustomedly serious. "I know you're up to something, and I want to explain." "What exactly?" Delia stared out the office window at the drizzling rain. Not over the phone. Let's meet. At our old cafe. She agreed, not knowing why herself. Maybe out of professional curiosity. It was interesting to hear him explain the tax avoidance schemes. Or maybe she just wanted to see once again the man she had once loved. The cafe hadn't changed. The same worn leather couches, the smell of freshly ground coffee, the soft music. Lance was waiting for her at their favorite table by the window. He'd lost weight, with shadows under his eyes and more gray in his hair. "You look beautiful," he said when she sat down across from him. "Let's skip the social niceties. What did you want to talk about?" He was quiet for a moment, twirling a cup of cooled coffee in his hands. "I know you've initiated a sweep of Raven's salons, and I'm going to ask you to stop." "I didn't initiate anything. This is a routine inspection." "Come on, I know you well enough. This isn't a coincidence." Delia shrugged. "Even so, I'm just doing my job. Didn't you teach me that finance is all about honesty?" He grumbled. "It's not that simple. Raven. She's got a complicated situation. These schemes are the only way to keep the business afloat. And that's why you're helping her skirt the law." "I'm helping her keep her life's work going," he pitched forward. "Look, I know I've hurt you, but this is personal. You don't need to ruin someone else's business because of our relationship." "Personal?" Delia grinned bitterly. "What about professional ethics, principles, all the things we believed in?" At that moment, Raven walked into the cafe. She clearly hadn't expected to see them here. Surprise flashed across her face for a second, replaced by irritation. "There you are." She walked over to their table. "And I've been calling you for half an hour." Lance flinched. "I told you I'd be busy." "Yeah, I can see that." Raven gave Delia a cold glare. "Decided to get nostalgic?" "We were discussing work," Delia replied calmly. "Work?" Raven laughed nervously. "You mean your little revenge? You think I don't know what's going on?" "Raven, not here." Lance stood up, trying to pull her away. "Why not here? Let everyone hear how your ex is using her official position to settle scores." Delia stood up as well. "You know what the funny thing is? I'm really just doing my job. You two, on the other hand, have a lot to worry about." She walked out of the cafe, feeling their stares with her back. Outside, a fine rain drizzled. Delia didn't open her umbrella. For some reason, she wanted to feel those cold drops on her face. In the evening, Lance texted, "I'm sorry about the cafe scene. I really wanted to explain everything. Why don't we try again?" She didn't reply. In her inbox was a new inspection report. It turned out that some of Raven's salons were operating without the necessary licenses. Another small detail in the overall picture of violations. At night, lying awake, Delia thought about how strangely life worked. Once she and Lance had dreamed of building an honest business, of being top-class professionals. Now he was helping his mistress pull off financial scams, and she was looking for evidence of those scams. The phone vibrated again. This time, the message was from Raven. "Don't play with fire. I have powerful friends." Delia smiled and deleted the message. It looked like the lull was coming to an end. Well, she was ready for it. At the IRS, the morning began with a fly-in. Mark Peterson gathered the department in the conference room where the most important and complex cases were usually discussed. "We're starting due diligence on the Brightwood Beauty Salon chain." He spread the paperwork out on the table. "Jim, you're on financial statements and cash flow. Sarah, you're on vendor and counterparty due diligence. Michael will handle the tax returns." Delia sat in the corner making notes in a notepad. It was no longer her business now. She had provided the materials and the machine was starting to work on its own. "What about these vendors?" Sarah looked up from the folder. 3 firms registered at the same address, and the building was demolished last year. "Exactly," Peterson nodded. "Start with them. Identify the real owners, check all the connections. If you find any other similar companies, get the tax police involved." After the meeting, Delia returned to her desk. Her current job involved other inspections, restaurants, stores, the usual routine, but by the edge of her ear she heard the machinery spinning. Sarah was calling the registry office, requesting data on vendor firms. Jim was methodically checking bank statements. Michael dealt with the declarations, frowning at the discrepancies in the figures. By lunchtime, the department received its first official response from the bank, confirming the strange transactions in the Crystal Rose accounts. After lunch, documents from the tax police arrived. It turned out that some of the vendor firms had already come to their attention on other cases. "Brightwood, have you seen this?" Jim approached her desk with a stack of printouts. "Remember that shell company case last year? Same schemes, even the registration addresses are similar." At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a representative of Crystal Rose, a young lawyer in an expensive suit, arrived at the inspectorate. He had a long talk with Peterson, waving some papers. Delia heard fragments of phrases, something about the unreasonableness of the inspection and violation of the rights of entrepreneurs. Toward evening, the first results of the tax police audit began to arrive. In one of the salons, they found an unaccounted cash register. In another, documents for equipment that was not physically available. The phone in the department did not stop ringing. We called from other inspectorates. Similar schemes had surfaced at them as well. Banks sent information about suspicious transactions. The tax police requested additional materials. Delia calmly went about her current work, only occasionally answering her colleagues' questions about the previously collected materials. She realized that there was no stopping the process now. Toward the end of the day, Raven literally flew into the department. Her usually flawless makeup was slightly smudged and her eyes were filled with panic. "Where's the department head?" She looked around the office, bumping her gaze to Delia. "Oh, so it's you. You're behind this, aren't you?" "Ma'am, you need to make an appointment," the secretary said politely. "To hell with an appointment. You have no right to conduct this inspection. I have all the necessary documents, which we will certainly examine as part of the inspection." Peterson, who appeared in the doorway, replied calmly, "Let's go to my office." Raven looked at Delia once more, both rage and fear read in that look. "You're going to regret this," she hissed, before following her superior. That evening, as she packed her things, Delia overheard her coworkers talking. "I've never seen anything like this," Jim was saying. "Every document we check leads to new violations. It's like a house of cards collapsing." "And it's kind of a clever scheme," Sarah echoed. "If it weren't for Brightwood's materials, we might not have noticed for a long time." Delia walked silently out of the office. In the parking lot, she spotted Lance's car. He was sitting behind the wheel, apparently waiting for Raven. Their gazes met, but both pretended not to notice each other. At home, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window. Somewhere in the city right now, Raven was trying to save her business. Lance was looking for a way out. The lawyers were preparing the paperwork. And here, in her small apartment, it was quiet and peaceful. Tuesday morning didn't start out as usual. Delia was still getting ready for work when the phone burst with urgent messages in the work chat. The tax police began a simultaneous audit of all Crystal Rose salons. There was unusual excitement in the office. Employees gathered around the monitors, which displayed live reports from the places of checks. Each salon of the network was checked by a separate group. Trained specialists methodically went through the list of necessary procedures. In the third salon, they found an unaccounted cash register, one of the inspectors reported over the phone. In the back room, there are boxes of unregistered products, beginning inventory. Delia quietly went about her current work, with only the edge of her ear listening to what was going on. Her involvement in this case formally ended when the inspection materials were handed over. By noon, the first official results began to come in. In the main office of Crystal Rose, tax inspectors found two sets of documentation, official and real. In the second salon, found seals of non-existent firm suppliers. In the fifth, the documents for the written-off equipment, which on the papers were listed as operating. "Brightwood, come in here," Peterson called out. Two representatives of the tax police were already sitting in his office. On the desk were photographs of the documents they had discovered. "Your materials have been fully corroborated," said one of them, "and the scale of the violations was even greater than originally thought." Delia nodded. "I simply gathered the facts." "And very professionally organized them," the other added. "Thanks to your work, we were able to run the operation simultaneously on all points. They didn't even have time to hide anything." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the first boxes of seized documents were brought to the inspection office. Sarah and Jim began sorting through them, glancing back and forth in surprise. "Have you seen this?" Sarah placed a folder in front of Delia. "The vendor contracts are backdated, and they didn't even try to hide it. The ink is fresh." At 3 o'clock, the tax police came to report that a search had begun at Raven's apartment. They found a safe with cash, the origin of which she could not explain, and a flash drive with unofficial accounting. Delia was just making tea when Lance literally burst into the department. He looked disheveled and scared. "What's going on?" He walked over to her desk. "You couldn't have... It's just..." "Sit down," she said calmly. "And calm down. Everything happened strictly according to the law." "The law?" He laughed nervously. "What about professional ethics? Using your official position for revenge?" "To establish the truth," she corrected, "and I'm just doing my job. By the way, you should talk to a lawyer. Given your involvement in drafting some of the documents..." Lance went pale and slumped in his chair. "You don't understand. Raven. She's thought of everything. She has connections, friends in high places." "Who would rather stay out of this case right now?" Delia finished. "Because everything is documented, everything is proven, and everything is perfectly legal." At that moment, Peterson entered the department with a new stack of documents. "Brightwood, take a look at this." "Ah, you have a visitor?" "Just leaving now." Delia looked at her ex-husband. "Really, Lance?" He stood up, pulled on his jacket, and headed for the exit. At the door, he turned around. "I didn't think you were capable of that." "I didn't think you were capable of falsifying documents either," she replied quietly. On her way home that evening, Delia saw reporters outside the Crystal Rose headquarters. The story was beginning to leak to the press. Tomorrow, everyone would know about major tax violations at the famous beauty salon chain. At home, she poured herself some tea and sat by the window. The phone was silent. Apparently, Raven was no longer in the mood for threats. Somewhere in the city, the tax police continued to describe the property. Lawyers were preparing documents, and investigators were studying the seized papers. Delia opened her work laptop. Tomorrow was going to be a normal day at the office. Other inspections, other documents, other violations. Life went on, and there was no room for personal revenge, only professional duty and the letter of the law. Lance Brightwood sat in his office at the law firm, looking out at the city through the panoramic window. On the desk was a letter from the IRS, a formal request for documents on all his contacts with Crystal Rose. He reread the dry lines for the third time, trying to find some hidden meaning in them. The phone vibrated again. Raven was calling for the fifth time that morning. He dropped the call. She'd been calling constantly since the inspections had started, demanding he do something about it, use the connections, find a way out, as if he could stop a mechanism already in motion. There was a knock at the door. The secretary brought another stack of documents, requests from banks for information on transactions with beauty salons, a demand from the firm's management to explain his role in preparing the documentation, a summons to talk to the tax inspection. The internal phone rang. Mr. Brightwood, Mr. Henderson is expecting you. The firm's managing partner rarely descended to the rank-and-file floors. His visit did not bode well. Have a seat, Lance. Henderson settled into the visitor's chair. We need to discuss your situation. The conversation lasted less than half an hour. The firm couldn't risk its reputation. Too many questions from the IRS. The clients are worried. Better to part ways amicably before the scandal was in full force. You have until the end of the week to turn things over, Henderson rose, and Lance, try to do it as correctly as possible. After he left, Lance opened the mail. The 2 job offers received last week had already been withdrawn. News traveled fast in the professional community. The phone rang again. This time Raven sent a message. Need to meet. Urgent. They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Raven looked unaccustomedly confused. They're describing the property. They're freezing the accounts. You have to do something. What exactly? He rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. They have all the documents. Your unofficial bookkeeping, contracts with fictitious suppliers. I told you these schemes were too risky. Told you? You designed them. You invented this whole supplier system. At your request, he pushed back the untouched coffee, and I warned you it might come out one day. So now what? She leaned across the table. You're going to dump me? As soon as it smells fried? He remained silent. What was there to say? That the career he'd spent 15 years building was crumbling? That no serious firm would hire him now? That all the connections she'd been so proud of had evaporated once the audit started? In the evening he sat at home, sorting through papers. Strangely, his thoughts kept returning to Delia, her calm gaze when she talked about professional ethics, her integrity, which he'd once mocked. A call from the IRS caught him putting together a resume. Mr. Brightwood, we need further clarification on some documents. He mechanically answered the questions, realizing that every word was being recorded and could be used against him, against Raven, against everything they had been building for the last year. After the conversation, he sat in the dark for a long time. His mind was spinning with numbers, charts, documents. Everything that had seemed so right, so simple, had fallen apart like a house of cards. And somewhere out there, in the tax inspection building, his ex-wife was methodically collecting evidence of his professional failure. In the morning came a letter from another potential employer, a polite refusal, veiled in general phrases. Reputation in the professional community was expensive, and he was only now beginning to realize the true cost of his decisions. Raven didn't call again. Apparently, she realized he could no longer help, or found another counselor willing to risk his career for her smile. On Friday, he packed up his office, a few files, a photo from a professional award ceremony, his favorite cup. 15 years of career fit into one box. The security guard on the way out averted his eyes, taking his pass. Just yesterday, he had smiled respectfully as he greeted the firm's senior partner. Today, he just nodded silently on the way out. In the car, Lance pulled out his cell phone and dialed Delia's number. His finger hovered over the call button. What could he tell her? That she was right? That he'd made a mistake? That he'd lost everything? Her, his career, his self-respect. He deleted the number and started the car. Somewhere in the city was his new life, without status, without connections, without illusions. A life where he would have to start all over again. And the hardest part was admitting that he had only himself to blame. The office of the divorce law firm was located in an old building with a stucco facade. Delia went up to the 3rd floor where her lawyer was waiting for her with a file of documents. Lance was late. It had become a habit of his lately. She pulled her file out of her bag. Everything had been prepared in advance. Inventory of jointly acquired assets, account statements, real estate documents. Years of working with financial records had taught her how to organize information flawlessly. Lance showed up 15 minutes later, slightly out of breath. He avoided making eye contact with her, immediately tucking himself into the papers the lawyer had placed in front of him. "So, let's get started." The lawyer pulled out a pen. "Miss Brightwood has prepared a draft property division agreement. You are welcome to review it." Delia watched Lance read the document. His eyebrows rose in surprise. She had no claim to the house, the car, or the joint bank accounts, just what she'd owned before the marriage and a small settlement. "That's it?" He looked up. "You don't want to—" "No," she shook her head. "I just want to close this matter and move on." The lawyer was clearly surprised. Usually these cases involved scandal and mutual complaints, but Delia methodically went through point by point, explaining her position on each issue. "The car is registered to you. It's yours." She turned the page. "The house is your choice. It's yours to live in. The bills. I think you'll need them given your current situation." Lance flinched. The hint of his shaky financial situation was obvious. But Delia spoke without gloating, simply stating a fact. "I don't understand." He set the papers aside. "Why don't you demand more? It's your right." "Because I don't need it," she shrugged. "I have a good job, a steady income, and I prefer to start a new life without the burden of the past." They methodically went through the formalities: signatures, stamps, notarization. Lance kept glancing at his ex-wife, trying to understand her motives. She, on the other hand, remained perfectly calm, as if she were doing her usual work documentation. "You know," he said as they walked out of the office, "I always thought you were too right, too predictable. And that's why you decided you could do whatever you wanted?" "No. I mean, yeah. I don't know." He ran a hand through his hair. "It's just that I realize now that I didn't know you at all. You turned out to be a lot stronger than I thought." "It's not about strength, Lance." She zipped up her bag. "It's about principles. You betrayed them, both in your personal life and in your profession, and I just stayed me." He wanted to say something back, but she was already walking toward her car, a small used sedan she'd bought after the move. So different from his expensive sports car. In the evening, Delia was sorting through the last boxes of old things. The wedding dress went to a charity. Photos of them together went in the trash. Documents in a separate folder in case they were needed. The phone jingled. A message from Lance. "You really don't look like the woman I married." She smiled and typed a reply. "I'm the same. You just never looked closely." The new apartment was quiet. No designer frills, just the bare essentials. But it did have her little office with a comfortable chair and desk to work in, a place where she could be herself, a pedantic tax inspector with a keen sense of justice. On the desk lay a fresh newspaper with a note about the problems of the Crystal Rose. Delia folded it and put it away in a drawer. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that tomorrow she would wake up a free person, without obligations, without compromising her conscience, without having to pretend to be someone else. In the morning she drove to work on a new route, deliberately avoiding places where she might accidentally bump into Lance. Ahead was a routine day filled with numbers, paperwork, and other people's tax returns, and she was grateful for that routine, which helped keep things moving along. Delia parked the car at a small public garden on the outskirts of town. The morning sun was already beating down, so she decided to take Charlie for an early walk. The golden retriever happily jumped out of the car. He loved those morning runs through the vacant lot. She'd gotten the dog spontaneously. She'd seen an ad in a shelter and realized she needed a friend who wouldn't ask questions or judge. Charlie turned out to be just that: loyal, kind, and absolutely indifferent to her career successes. And there were successes. After the Crystal Rose case, she was promoted to department head. A new position, a new office, young employees who had to be trained in the intricacies of tax audits. Charlie ran around the vacant lot, chasing butterflies, while Delia pondered the day's work ahead. After her run, she planned to stop by a small coffee shop nearby, where they made great coffee to go. The coffee shop was located in an old neighborhood, among shabby five-story buildings. The place was usually empty at this hour. The locals preferred the chain establishments in the malls. After tying Charlie up at the entrance and promising him a treat, she pushed open the door. She froze on the threshold. Lance and Raven were sitting at the far table. They were arguing softly over cups of the cheapest coffee on the menu. Raven was wearing a simple mass-market dress, a surprising contrast to her previous closet. Lance, in a wrinkled shirt, seemed tired. They didn't notice Delia, absorbed in their conversation. "We need to look for another job," it came to her. "This consulting firm is a dead end." "And who's going to hire you? After everything?" Delia turned and walked out, deciding that coffee could wait. Charlie's tail wagged affably, and she rubbed it behind his ears. Strangely, she felt no gloating or satisfaction, only a slight bewilderment. How could she be married to a man who so easily compromised his principles? On her way to work, she turned on her favorite radio station. Ahead was an important day, an audit of a large retail chain, new documents, new tax avoidance schemes. The usual job of a tax inspector, which suddenly turned out to be the most reliable anchor in her life. A stack of documents and a cup of freshly brewed tea awaited her in the office. Her new assistant had quickly learned her habits. On the desk was a folder with a submission for a departmental award. Her professionalism in the Crystal Rose case was highly appreciated by the management. In the evening, she went to the vacant lot again. Charlie liked long walks at sunset. The dog was happily chasing a ball, and Delia thought about how strange life was. Once she had dreamed of a luxurious house, expensive cars, and a husband of status. Now she was content with a small apartment, an old sedan, and a faithful dog. Passing by the coffee shop, she saw that it was dark. The place was closing early. She wondered where Lance and Raven's life would take them next. That wasn't her story, though. She had her own road to travel, maybe not as spectacular, but honest. Charlie tugged on the leash, reminding her it was time to go home. Tomorrow was a new day at work, new paperwork, new inspections. And she was glad for this simple and straightforward life, where everything was measured not by designer clothes and expensive cars, but by clear principles and professional integrity. After all, being true to yourself is also a kind of victory.